Drop every one of those overgrown cottonwoods. Community sightlines must be restored. That's what the HOA president yelled at her husband's tree clearance foreman on a cold Tuesday morning in October. The cottonwoods were a 60-year-old windbreak of cottonwoods bur oaks and Norway spruce my father had planted on our family ranch's western boundary in 1965. By noon, 52 mature trees had been felled and bucked into 10 FT logs. The HOA had cut the very windbreak that had been keeping my Hereford cow-calf operation visually and olfactory separated from 110 Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji Homes for 58 years. Constance Traws did not yet know that I had spent 28 years as a swine specialist at Iowa State Extension, and that the cleared section of windbreak, now legally exposed under Iowa KO setback rules, was perfectly sized for the 4,800-head hog confinement operation I had been pricing since March. Tell me below, what would you do? The Osland Place sits on the east shore of East Okoboji Lake in Dickinson County, Iowa, 9 miles north of the town of Spirit Lake on a county road called Cottonwood Lane that my grandfather paved the first 2 miles of with his own savings in 1962. 480 acres of corn ground, hay meadow pasture, and 120 acres of A1 agricultural zoned upland that wraps from the lakefront pasture up to the western section line. The ranch headquarters sits on a low rise above the lake. The barns sit 200 yards west of the headquarters. My grandfather had built the original barn in 1949. My father had rebuilt the dairy parlor in 1971. I had built the swine research wing, a small 24-pen study facility for my Iowa State Extension work in 2004. The original 60-year-old shelter belt, 3 rows of cottonwoods bur oaks, and Norway spruce, ran along the entire western section line from 1965 until the HOA cut it down on the morning of October 14th. My grandfather Olaf Osland bought the parcel in 1947 with the savings from 9 years of working in the Horrell plant in Austin, Minnesota. The deed has been in the Osland family for 78 years. The original closing papers typed on onion skin by a Spencer attorney named Erland Haverson still sit in the deed box on the parlor mantel beside my grandmother's confirmation photograph and a tin of buttons from her wedding dress. The closing fee was $19. The cashier's check from the Horrell teller window in Austin was made out to the previous owner, a Civil War widow's granddaughter named Eninga Sunheim, for $4,200. Even I'm Sten Osland, I'm 67. I have never been married. I have no biological children. I spent 28 years as an Iowa State University Extension swine specialist. I authored 14 peer-reviewed papers on Iowa hog production economics, manure management, and KO regulatory compliance. I served as past chair of the Iowa Pork Producers Association from 2014 to 2017. I helped draft 3 amendments to Iowa's Right to Farm statute, Iowa Code Chapter 657A, between 2008 and 2019. I retired from Iowa State in 2022. I also hold a master's in agricultural law from Drake University Law School, which I completed at age 46 because I wanted to read the Iowa Administrative Code without an interpreter. My sister Hilda Osland is 65. She and her late husband Eskal Haverson ran the family Hereford cow-calf operation from 1988 until Eskal's passing in 2018. Since then, Hilda and I have run the operation together. We maintain a herd of 120 Hereford mother cows on the lakefront pasture and the eastern corn ground. My niece Helena is 38. She is an Iowa State University Extension agricultural extension agent for Dickinson and EMTT counties. She lives in the small craftsman bungalow Hilda and Essel built on the south side of the ranch in 2003. Helena's husband Bjarn is 40. He is a large animal veterinarian with a practice in Spirit Lake. They have 2 children, Lynn, age 10, and Sigfrid, age 7. In the spring of 2018, a development company called Lakeshore Vista Properties broke ground on a 110-home luxury recreational subdivision on the section of East Okoboji shoreline directly south of our family ranch. They called the development Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji. In 2021, a 49-year-old woman named Constance Traz took over the Lakeshore Vista HOA presidency. She drove a pearl white Lincoln Navigator with a vanity plate that read Connie T. Her husband Dorian owned a regional company called Traz Heritage Forestry LLC. The company specialized in residential tree clearance, easement line maintenance, and view enhancement services for HOA-governed recreational developments across the Iowa Great Lakes region. Constance Traz wrote me her first letter in May of 2022. She wanted the windbreak gone. She would 2 years later get exactly what she had asked for. She would not, however, get what came after. Constance Traz's first letter in May of 2022 was a polite request that I consider selective canopy management along the western section line shelter belt to restore unobstructed sunset views over Iowa farmland for Lakeshore Vista community members. I wrote her a polite letter back declining. I explained that the shelter belt was a registered windbreak under the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau's Iowa Shelter Belt Inventory Program. I explained that it had been planted by my father in 1965 with Iowa State Extension agronomic guidance, and that it provided documented soil and microclimate benefits to our corn ground, our pasture, and our Hereford herd. I explained that no canopy management was contemplated. She did not respond. Her second letter in October of 2022 raised the request to complete removal of the obstructive overstory along the eastern Lakeshore Vista boundary. I wrote a second polite letter back. I explained that the shelter belt was entirely on Oland family land. I explained that the eastern Lakeshore Vista boundary did not in fact share a property line with our western section line because of a recorded 40 ft road easement that separated the two parcels. I explained that the HOA had no standing to request removal of any vegetation on our private land. She did not respond. Her third letter in March of 2023 was the first to mention her husband's company. The letter recommended that we consider engaging a qualified regional forestry contractor with extensive HOA adjacent landowner experience to perform a complementary canopy assessment. The recommended contractor was TR Heritage Forestry LLC. I did not engage Traz Heritage Forestry LLC. I did, however, drive into Spirit Lake the following Tuesday and pull every Traz Heritage Forestry tree clearance permit filing with the Dickinson County Recorder's Office for the previous 5 years. The filings revealed a pattern. Traz Heritage Forestry LLC had filed 31 clearance permits in Dickinson County between 2018 and 2023. Of those 31, 26 had been on properties adjacent to recreational HOA developments. Of those 26, 22 had specifically targeted mature windbreak vegetation, multi-row shelter belts of cottonwoods, oaks, and conifers planted between 1955 and 1980 as part of Iowa's post-Dust Bowl conservation program. The pattern suggested that Traz Heritage Forestry LLC was systematically targeting Iowa's mid-20th century shelter belt infrastructure at the request of HOA-affiliated clients. I drove out to one of the prior landowners, a 68-year-old retired Iowa State Patrol trooper named Wendell Brimstead at Lot 12 outside the Trillium Bay HOA at 4 in the afternoon. Wendell Brimstead listened to me for an hour. He sat down his coffee. He said, "Mr. Osland, I lost my father's 1958 windbreak in February of 2021. Traz Heritage Forestry came out under an emergency vegetation management notice the HOA filed with Dickinson County. The notice claimed the windbreak posed a community visual integrity risk. I was at my mother's funeral in Sioux Falls. By the time I got home, 420 mature trees had been cut. Traz Heritage hauled them off in a flatbed. The HOA paid Traz Heritage $41,500 for the removal, the timber. If you do the math on Iowa walnut and oak prices in February of 2021, was worth approximately $226,000 on the secondary market. I asked him if he had documented the loss. He had photographs. He had the original 1958 windbreak planting plan signed by his father and an Iowa State Extension forester. He had Traz Heritage Forestry's clearance invoice. He had the receipted Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau Shelter Belt Inventory records showing the windbreak as a registered post-Dust Bowl heritage planting. He had a 50-page binder of weekly soil moisture readings his father had taken at the windbreak's eastern drip line from 1962 until his stroke in 2004. He had everything. He had been waiting for someone to ask him about it for 4 years. He took me out to his back pasture. The cut stumps were still there, weathered gray now, 42 months after the chainsaws. The ground around them was bone-dry and cracked. The pasture behind the cut line, where his black Angus once grazed, had gone to thistle and curly dock. He set his palm on one of the stumps and held it there for a long time. He did not say anything. The wind smelled like dust and old grease. I drove home that evening with the case starting to form in my head. The Traws family was running an Iowa shelter belt timber theft operation through HOA-affiliated community visual enhancement requests. The estimated total revenue from the 22 prior windbreak clearances based on Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau timber valuation data, approximately $1.4 million in stolen secondary market timber value, plus approximately $340,000 in fraudulent HOA clearance fees. The Traws family was running a $1.7 million Iowa Heritage Shelter Belt theft scheme. I had not yet contacted anyone outside my family. Constance Traws had not yet escalated against my own shelter belt. I needed her to escalate. She would 18 months later on the morning of October 14th. Between March of 2023 and October of 2025, I built the case against the Traws family quietly. Helena helped. She had grown up on this ranch. She had been my niece for 38 years. She had served as an Iowa State University Extension agricultural extension agent for Dickinson and EMTT counties for the previous 11 years. She had access through her professional role to Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau Shelter Belt inventory records, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship right to farm registry filings, and the Iowa Pork Producers Association Regional Database. She also had access to the Iowa Department of Justice Consumer Protection Division through her position as a state employee. She agreed to compile the documentation under a confidential professional records review protocol that her department had authorized in May of 2023, specifically for cases involving heritage shelter belt destruction patterns. By August of 2023, Helena had identified 18 prior Iowa landowners across 6 counties who had lost shelter belt windbreaks to Heritage Forestry LLC clearances between 2018 and 2022. Dickinson, EMTT, Clay, Palo Alto, O'Brien, and Buena Vista. 6 Iowa counties, 18 Iowa farms. 18 Iowa families whose grandfathers had planted windbreaks in the years between the Soil Conservation Service's founding in 1935 and the Carter administration's Rural Conservation and Development Act of 1980. Each one of them had been told the same thing by a Traws Heritage Forestry letter. Each one of them had been told the trees were a community visual integrity risk. Each one of them had lost their windbreak inside a 6-day window. We interviewed them one at a time over the next 22 months. 14 of the 18 agreed to provide sworn statements. 2 had passed away in the intervening years. 2 declined to participate for personal reasons. The 14 sworn statements were notarized and held in escrow by my attorney, Aldrich Eklund, of Eklund and Associates in Spirit Lake. Aldrich had been my attorney for 31 years. He had grown up on a hog operation outside Storm Lake. He had drafted my Iowa State University Extension consulting agreements, my Iowa Pork Producers Association service contracts, and my agricultural law master's program enrollment paperwork at Drake. He had a quiet way of reading regulatory statutes that I had relied on since 1994. He read all 14 sworn statements. He read the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau Shelter Belt Inventory records. He read the Traws Heritage Forestry LLC business filings. He set everything down at his Spirit Lake office on a Wednesday afternoon in January of 2024. He said, "Sten, this is an Iowa Department of Justice Consumer Protection Division case. It is also potentially federal under Title 18 U.S.C. 1341 mail fraud and Title 18 U.S.C. 1956 money laundering. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship has standing on the shelter belt destruction itself under Iowa Code Chapter 161A. We need to coordinate with 3 state agencies and the federal U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Iowa. I asked him when to file. He thought about it for a long minute. He said, "Sten, the pattern is established. The 14 victims are documented. The Traws family business filings are public, but the federal predicate has not yet activated. We need the Traws family to act against you overtly on the record with documentary evidence before the federal mail fraud predicate locks. Until then we wait." I waited. In the meantime, I began the second track. The second track was the hog farm. I had been thinking quietly about expanding the family's swine operations onto the western upland for 19 years. I had presented preliminary engineering for a 4,800 head hog confinement operation at the 2014 Iowa Pork Congress as a case study in modern KO design. I had updated the engineering specifications every 3 years since the western upland 120 acres of A1 agricultural zoned land that ran from the western section line east to the cattle barn was the obvious site. The site was approximately 1/4 mile east of the western section line. The site sat upwind of Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji approximately 75% of the time based on prevailing southwesterly winds documented by the Iowa Climatological Survey. The hog farm had always been technically permittable. It had not been politically advisable. While the 60-year-old shelter belt remained intact, the shelter belt provided a visual and olfactory buffer that in Iowa right-to-farm jurisprudence established a level of good neighbor practice that any future nuisance complaint by Lakeshore Vista would have faced as a defense. The legal architecture matters. Iowa Code Chapter 657A is the strongest right-to-farm statute in the upper Midwest. It was written in 1979 by a coalition of Iowa State University Extension agronomists, Iowa Pork Producers Association leadership, and Iowa Farm Bureau policy staff. It is grounded in 3 legal pillars. For an agricultural operation on properly zoned agricultural land cannot be enjoined as a nuisance by adjacent residential property owners regardless of when the residential use commenced. Second, a residential development that locates adjacent to existing agricultural land assumes the burden of agricultural impact as a function of the relocation. Third, an agricultural operation that is expanded onto previously agricultural zone land within the same parcel does not constitute a new nuisance for the purposes of Iowa nuisance law. The takeaway is short. If a shelter belt comes down between an Iowa farm and an Iowa HO, Iowa law assumes the farm wins. Without the shelter belt, if Constance Traws ever managed to remove it, the buffer would be gone. The hog farm would be visible. The hog farm would be smelled. Lakeshore Vista would have no recourse because Iowa Code Chapter 657A would preempt any nuisance complaint. I needed her to cut the shelter belt. She needed to cut it on her own initiative, on the record, in a manner that established her intent. She would do it on October 14th. The morning of October 14th was 46 degrees and clear with a southwest wind at 14 mph. I had been awake since 4:30. I had been on my front porch since 5 with a thermos of black coffee and a copy of the Iowa Code Chapter 657A annotated volume my Drake Law School advisor had given me at my graduation in 2004. Hilda came out of the porch at 6. She brought a second thermos and a slice of her homemade rhubarb strawberry pie. She said, "Sten. Today I told her I thought so," she said. "I will be in the barn with the Herefords. Helena and Bjarne will be on the south porch. Lynn and Sigfrid will be at school by 7:40. I told her thank you." She walked back to the kitchen. At 8:15, the Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji HOA newsletter October issue arrived in our mailbox by Iowa Rural Mail Carrier Delivery. I read the issue at the kitchen island with Hild. Page 7 carried a 1-paragraph item under Community Improvement Activity Briefs. It read, "Members will be pleased to know that the Lakeshore Vista HOA has secured arrangements with Traws Heritage Forestry, LLC, for a community-wide canopy enhancement project beginning Tuesday, October 14th. That will significantly improve the Long-standing visual obstructions along the eastern lakeshore vista boundary. The item did not name our property. The item did not need to name our property. The only vegetation east of the lakeshore vista property line that could plausibly be characterized as a visual obstruction was our family shelter belt. I called Aldrich Eklund at 8:23. He read the newsletter paragraph aloud back to me from his fax machine printout. He said, "Sten, that's the predicate document. The HOA has published on the record an intent to perform a canopy enhancement project that targets vegetation it has no legal right to touch. The next overt act activates the federal mail fraud predicate because this newsletter was distributed by United States Postal Service to 110 Lakeshore Vista households." I asked him what I should do. He said, "Sten, stay on your porch. Document everything. Do not interfere. Do not engage. Let the cut occur. Let it be photographed. Let it be witnessed by your sister, your niece, and your nephew-in-law. Let the predicate complete itself." I told him yes. At 9:03 Tuesday morning, a Traz Heritage Forestry LLC 3-truck convoy turned onto Cottonwood Lane from the south. The lead vehicle was Constance Traz Pearl White Lincoln Navigator. The second vehicle was a Ford F-450 with the Traz Heritage Forestry LLC logo on the door, hauling a flatbed trailer, carrying a Caterpillar 320 hydraulic excavator. The third vehicle was a Peterbilt logging truck with a 40-foot empty bed. The convoy parked along the western section line on the Lakeshore Vista side of the recorded 40 FT road easement. 6 tree crew members exited the vehicles in matching forest green Traz Heritage Forestry jackets. They unloaded chainsaws, climbing harnesses, and a high-lift man basket. Constance Traz walked the section line for 19 minutes with her foreman. She pointed at trees. At 9:15, the foreman gave the cut order. The first chainsaw started at 917. The first cottonwood, a 60-year-old 80-foot tree my father had planted in the spring of 1965, with my mother's hand-laid root ball wrapping, came down at 9:23. Helena began photographing from the south porch, began videotaping from the equipment shed with our two-way trail camera tripod. Hilda began counting trees in a yellow legal pad on the kitchen island. I did not move from the front porch. By 11:30, 52 mature trees had been felled. By noon, all 52 trees had been bucked into 10-foot sections. By 12:45, the Peterbilt logging truck was loaded. At 10:03 Tuesday afternoon, the Traz Heritage Forestry convoy drove away. The shelter belt, 60 years of Osland family land use planning, was gone. I sat on the porch for 20 more minutes. I called Aldrich Eklund at 1:26. I told him the predicate was complete. I told him to file. Aldrich Eklund filed the federal complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Iowa at 3:50 Tuesday afternoon. He filed the parallel state complaint with the Iowa Department of Justice Consumer Protection Division at 4:05. He filed the parallel state complaint with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. At 4:15, he filed the parallel civil complaint with the Dickinson County District Court at 4:37. By 6 p.m. Tuesday, every agency had a copy of the 14 sworn statements, the Traz Heritage Forestry LLC business filings, the Iowa Shelter Belt inventory records, and the October 14th predicate documentation. By 8:00 p.m. Tuesday, Iowa Department of Justice Consumer Protection Senior Deputy Attorney General Elinor Felstad had opened the formal state investigation. By Wednesday morning, Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Ula Cordero of the Sioux City Resident Office had opened the parallel federal investigation. By Wednesday afternoon, Assistant United States Attorney Ivar Eklund, no relation to my attorney, Aldrich Eklund, of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Iowa in Cedar Rapids, had been assigned as lead federal prosecutor. By Thursday morning, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Forestry Bureau Director Larson Toberman had opened the parallel agricultural investigation. By Thursday afternoon, the federal investigation team had cross-referenced our 14 sworn statements with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Forestry Bureau Shelter Belt inventory records and confirmed that 22 of the prior TR Heritage Forestry clearances had targeted federally registered Iowa shelter belts dating from the post-dust conservation period of 1935 to 1980. Federal exposure was significantly larger than my original estimate. Special Agent Cordero called me Thursday at 4:15 with the updated numbers, she said. Stentraws Heritage Forestry LLC has cleared approximately 350 mature trees per prior clearance event across 22 events over the previous 5 years. The total secondary market timber value calculated against Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship 2025 valuation tables is approximately $1.8 million. The total HOA clearance fees collected from 22 HOAs is approximately $420,000. Combined Traws family fraud exposure is approximately $2.2 million. She continued. The federal indictment will be drafted by next Friday. The state indictment will be drafted in parallel. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship will pursue Iowa Code Chapter 161, a heritage shelter belt destruction charges separately. She said one more thing, Sten. The federal indictment will not be unsealed for at least 6 weeks. The grand jury process takes time. The Traws family does not yet know they are under investigation. In the interim, you may proceed with any agricultural operations on your own land that are permittable under Iowa Code, Chapter 657A. I asked her if she understood what I was about to do. She thought about it for a long second. She said, Sten, I read your 2014 Iowa Pork Congress paper on modern KO design as part of my background research this morning. I understand. I told her. Thank you. I hung up. I drove to the Dickinson County Zoning Office Friday morning at 8:30. I filed the formal permit application for a 4,800 head hog confinement operation on the western upland of the Osland Ranch. The Dickinson County Zoning Office processed my permit application under Iowa Administrative Code 567, Chapter 65, which governs Iowa co-siting requirements. The application met every Iowa CFO setback rule. The application demonstrated the required 900 FT setback from any residential structure, the required 1,200 FT setback from any major drinking water source, and the required 1,800 FT setback from any incorporated municipality boundary. It met the Iowa Department of Natural Resources construction permit requirements. It met the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship manure management plan requirements. It met the Iowa Department of Public Health air quality requirements. The permit was approved on November 12th. Construction began on November 18th. The general contractor was Haverson Agricultural Construction of Spencer, Iowa, a 41-year-old family-owned firm that had built 317 Iowa hog confinement operations between 1984 and 2025. The lead engineer was a 53-year-old Iowa State University graduate named Bridget Lindelof. The 4,800 head hog confinement operation was scheduled for completion by April 1st. Construction proceeded on schedule through November, December, January, and February. Constance Traws filed her first attempt to stop the construction on December 3rd. She filed a formal nuisance complaint with the Dickinson County District Court, alleging that the planned hog confinement operation would create intolerable odor, visual, and water quality impacts on Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji Homes. Aldrich Eklund filed a motion to dismiss on Iowa Code Chapter 657, a right to farm preemption grounds. On December 5th, Judge Kalbertenberg of Dickinson County District Court granted the motion to dismiss with prejudice. On December 9th, he cited Iowa Code 657A1, which establishes that an agricultural operation on properly zoned agricultural land cannot be enjoined as a nuisance by adjacent residential property owners, regardless of when the residential use commenced. He awarded Aldrich Eklund $19,000 in sanctions. Constance Traws filed her second attempt on January 7th. This time, she filed an emergency petition with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources requesting that the IDNR revoke the CAFO construction permit on the grounds that the operation would impose disproportionate environmental burden on adjacent residential properties. The Iowa DNR Director's Office reviewed the petition and rejected it within 72 hours, noting that the application had met every applicable Iowa environmental compliance standard and that the IDNR had no statutory authority to revoke a properly issued permit absent demonstrated noncompliance. Constance Traz filed her third attempt on February 12. This time, she filed a federal civil action under the Federal Clean Air Act seeking to halt construction on emissions grounds. The federal action was assigned to Judge Helga Sigerson of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Iowa. Judge Sigerson dismissed the action on March 3, citing established Federal Clean Air Act precedent that small-scale agricultural operations are not subject to Clean Air Act stationary source permitting requirements. She also awarded Aldrich Eklund $42,000 in federal sanctions against Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji HOA. Constance Traz had now lost 3 legal challenges in 86 days. She had been sanctioned for $61,000. The hog confinement operation was 26 days from completion. On March 28, the construction crew commissioned the manure management system. On March 30, the operation received its first shipment of 400 feeder pigs from a Hormel-affiliated nursery contractor in Albert Lea, Minnesota. On April 1, the operation received the remaining 4,400 feeder pigs across 9 separate truck deliveries. The trucks arrived in 2-hour intervals from 6:00 in the morning until 8 at night. Each delivery offloaded under the supervision of BIA, who had been the operation's contracted veterinary supervisor since the permit went in. Each delivery was logged into the Iowa State University Extension swine production database. Helena had configured the previous January. Each feeder pig was tagged weighed and pen assigned within 90 minutes of arrival. By April 3, the operation was at full capacity. The operation employed 19 full-time Iowa State University Extension trained swine production technicians, contributed approximately $840,000 annually to the Dickinson County agricultural tax base, and represented a long-planned modernization of our family's pork production capacity that I had been pricing engineering specifications for since 2014. The prevailing southwesterly wind began carrying hog confinement air across the western Lakeshore Vista property line on the afternoon of April 3 at approximately 3:15. The wind has not significantly shifted since. By April 10, 14 Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji households had listed their homes for sale. By April 23, the number had grown to 26. By May 7, 38, the Dickinson County real estate market for Lakeshore Vista resale homes collapsed within the first 30 days. Average list prices dropped 28%. The average days on market for Lakeshore Vista properties extended from 11 days in March to 163 days by mid-May. None of the 38 listed homes received an offer above asking. Constance Traz filed her 4th attempt to stop the hog confinement operation on April 22. This time, she filed a state legislative petition seeking emergency amendment of Iowa Code Chapter 657A to allow HOA affiliated residential property owners to enjoin adjacent agricultural operations under specified conditions. The petition was reviewed by the Iowa House Agriculture Committee on May 5. The committee chair was a third-generation Iowa hog farmer from Hardin County. The petition was rejected by a vote of 9-0, with 2 abstentions on May 7. The Iowa Pork Producers Association, of which I had been past chair, issued a public statement on May 9 describing the petition as an unprecedented attack on Iowa's foundational agricultural protections and urging the Iowa legislature to reaffirm Chapter 657A in its current form. The Iowa legislature reaffirmed Chapter 657A in its current form on May 20. Constance Traz had now lost 4 legal and legislative challenges in 128 days. She had been personally sanctioned for an additional $18,000 in the state legislative petition matter. Her cumulative legal losses to date stood at $79,000. The federal indictment had been sealed since late January. It was unsealed on May 23. The indictment named Dorian Traz on 23 federal counts, including mail fraud, wire fraud, federal heritage forestry destruction under the Lacey Act, money laundering, and conspiracy. It named Constance Traz on 12 federal counts, including conspiracy, HOA breach of fiduciary duty, federal wire fraud, and obstruction. It named Traz Heritage Forestry LLC as a corporate defendant on all 23 counts. Special Agent Ula Cordero arrived at the Traz residence at 4847 Lakeshore Vista Drive at 6:15 Friday morning, May 23, with 2 federal investigators, 2 Iowa Department of Justice paralegals, and an Iowa State Patrol Commercial Crimes Unit deputy. Constance Traz answered the door in a coral robe. She had not yet had her morning coffee. Special Agent Cordero served the federal arrest warrant at 6:18. Constance Traz was placed in federal custody at 6:20. A simultaneous federal arrest team led by Special Agent Walram Haverson arrived at the Traz Heritage Forestry LLC office at 217 East Okoboji Avenue in Spirit Lake at 6:20 Friday morning. Dorian Traz was placed in federal custody at 6:25. The Traz Heritage Forestry LLC office computers, files, and business records were seized under federal warrant at 6:30. By 8 a.m. Friday morning, the federal indictment had been published in the Spirit Lake Beacon, the Estherville Daily News, and the Sioux City Journal. By noon Friday, the Des Moines Register had run a 5,800-word feature on the Iowa Heritage Shelter Belt destruction pattern, citing the Oland Ranch as the case study. By 3 a.m. Friday, the Iowa Public Television Iowa Press Public Affairs program had announced a half-hour special on Iowa Right to Farm protections, featuring an interview with Iowa Pork Producers Association current chair Larson Toberman. By Friday evening, the Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji HOA had held an emergency residence meeting that 31 of the 110 households attended. The meeting passed an emergency resolution recalling Constance Traz from the HOA presidency. The vote was 31-0, Hildy Helena Bia, and I sat on the porch that Friday evening with a bottle of bourbon Aldrich Eklund had sent over by courier. Lynn and Sigvard were inside playing checkers. Hilda poured 4 small glasses. She raised hers, she said. "Stand to Daddy's shelter belt." I raised mine, I said. "To Daddy's shelter belt." Special Agent Ula Cordero held the federal press conference on the steps of the U.S. Federal Courthouse in Sioux City at 10:00 a.m. Saturday, May 24th. I was present. So was Helena. So was Wendell Brimstead, the retired Iowa State Patrol trooper who had been the first prior Traz Heritage Forestry victim I had interviewed in March of 2023. So were 9 of the 14 prior victims who had provided sworn statements. So was Larson Toberman, the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Forestry Bureau Director. So was Iowa Senior Deputy Attorney General Elinor Felstad. So was Assistant United States Attorney Ivar Eklund. Special Agent Cordio spoke for 23 minutes. She walked through the 23 federal counts. She walked through the 5-year Iowa Heritage Shelter Belt destruction pattern. She walked through the $1.8 million in stolen secondary market timber value. She walked through the $420,000 in fraudulent HOA clearance fees. She named the 22 HOAs that had participated in the scheme. She named the 14 prior landowner victims. She named Constance Traz. She named Dorian Traz. She named Traz Heritage Forestry LLC. She thanked the Iowa Pork Producers Association for 50 years of agricultural policy leadership. She thanked the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship for its Heritage Shelter Belt inventory work. She thanked Helena Brimwold by name for her Iowa State University Extension Professional Records Review. She thanked Aldrich Eklund for his 31 years of agricultural law practice in Dickinson County. She thanked the 14 prior Iowa landowner victims whose sworn statements had built the case. She invited me to speak. I walked to the podium with a single document in my left hand. The document was the Iowa Code Chapter 657A annotated volume my Drake Law School advisor had given me at my graduation in 2004. I held the volume where the Sioux City Journal photographer could see it. I said, "Members of the press, members of the Iowa agricultural community, and to anyone watching from the 110 Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji homes south of my ranch. My father planted a 60-year-old shelter built on the western boundary of our family land in the spring of 1965. He planted 3 rows of cottonwoods, bur oaks, and Norway spruce in soil he and my mother had personally amended with composted dairy manure from our barn. The shelter belt was the buffer between our cattle operation and any future neighbors. For 57 years, it served exactly that purpose." I lifted the code volume, I said, In October of 2025, the Lakeshore Vista HOA cut down my father's shelter belt. The HOA assumed that the act of cutting the trees would cause my agricultural operations to recede from their visual horizon. The opposite occurred. Under Iowa Code Chapter 657A, my agricultural operations are protected from any nuisance complaint by adjacent residential property owners, regardless of when the residential use commenced. The shelter belt had been the only thing keeping my cattle operations visually and alachly distant from Lakeshore Vista. Without the shelter belt, my long-planned hog confinement modernization became operationally viable on the western upland. I let the sentence sit. I said the Lakeshore Vista HOA cut down the buffer between us. The HOA paid Troz Heritage Forestry, LLC $41,500 to do it. The HOA distributed a newsletter on October 14th by United States Postal Service announcing the project. The newsletter was the federal mail fraud predicate. The federal indictment unsealed yesterday is the consequence. I lowered the code volume. I said Iowa Code Chapter 657A is the heritage of every Iowa farm. It was written by Iowa legislators in 1979 to protect Iowa farmers from urban encroachment. It was amended in 2008, 2014, and 2019 with contributions from working Iowa agricultural producers. 3 of those amendments bear my name. I would like every adjacent HOA in the state of Iowa to read this chapter before they cut down another shelter belt. I handed the code volume to Larson Taberman. He held it up. The Sioux City Journal photographer captured 47 frames. Larson Taberman then said one sentence at the podium. He said, "The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship will be distributing free copies of the Iowa Code, Chapter 657A, annotated volume, to every HOA secretary in the state of Iowa within the next 30 days. He turned to the camera. He said, "Mrs. Troz, the shelter belt was the warning. The hog farm is the consequence. Iowa Code Chapter 657A is the law that connects them." The press conference closed at 10:37. By Saturday afternoon, the Iowa Pork Producers Association had announced a new educational initiative funded jointly with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, providing free Iowa Code Chapter 657A workshops to every Iowa HOA board that requested one. By Sunday afternoon, 28 Iowa HOA boards had submitted requests. By Monday morning, the number had grown to 51. Dorian Troz pleaded guilty in October to 31 federal counts spanning federal mail fraud, federal wire fraud, federal Lacey Act, heritage forestry destruction, federal money laundering, and conspiracy. 12 years federal at FCI Yankton, plus $2.4 million in restitution distributed across 14 prior Iowa landowner victims, plus Iowa Department of Natural Resources shelter belt restoration funding. Constance Troz pleaded guilty in December to 14 federal counts spanning conspiracy, HOA breach of fiduciary duty, federal wire fraud, and obstruction. 5 years federal at FCI was plus $420,000 in restitution distributed across the 22 HOAs whose members had paid the fraudulent clearance fees. Troz Heritage Forestry LLC was dissolved by federal court order. The remaining corporate assets, approximately $870,000, were placed in court-supervised receivership for distribution to the 14 prior victims and the participating HOAs. The 14 prior Iowa shelter belt destruction victims received restitution averaging approximately $172,000 per household. Wendell Brimstead received his check at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Spirit Lake Field office. In February, he drove home in his 2003 Ford F-250 with the check folded in his shirt pocket. He sat at his kitchen table for an hour before he cashed it. He bought a 1-ton unload of Iowa-grown white oak shelter belt saplings from a Decorah nursery the next morning. He planted them on the southern boundary of his property, the boundary where his father's 1,958 windbreak had been cut down in February of 2021. He has been watering them every Sunday since. The other 12 prior victims used their restitution checks to replant their family shelter belts as well. Helena coordinated a regional Iowa shelter belt replanting cooperative through her Iowa State University Extension office that by the end of the calendar year had organized replanting projects on 26 Iowa farms across the 6 affected counties. The Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship contributed matching funds. The Iowa State Forester's Office contributed seedlings at cost. The Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji HOA was reconstituted in June under new bylaws. The new board's first chair was a 63-year-old former Iowa Department of Public Safety Regional Commander named Tor Renwald, who had retired to Lakeshore Vista in 2020 and had been quietly waiting for an opportunity to challenge Constance Traw's leadership since 2022. Tor Renwald's first board action was to file a formal apology with the Osland family for the October 14th shelter belt destruction. His second board action was to authorize a $110,000 HOA contribution to a replanted shelter belt project on the Osland Western Section line. The replanting began on May 15th. The new shelter belt, 3 rows of cottonwoods, bur oaks, and Norway spruce planted under Iowa State University Extension guidance went into the ground over a 6-week period in May and June. 41 Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji residents personally participated in the replanting. Helena coordinated the volunteer schedule. Hilda supervised the soil amendment. Beyond coordinated the KID program in which 17 Lakeshore Vista children worked alongside Lynn and Sigvard to plant the spruce row. The volunteer days started at 6:30 in the morning. Hilda served cinnamon rolls and black coffee from the kitchen island. Helena marked each sapling site with surveyor's flags the evening before. Beyond checked every child for proper boots, gloves, and safety glasses at the equipment shed. I stood at the western section line and pointed at each row in turn, cottonwood, bur oak, Norway spruce, and walked the Lakeshore Vista volunteers through the original 1,965 planting plan my father had hand-drawn on butcher paper. They listened. They asked questions. They took notes. Several of them apologized to me individually before they took up their shovels. By July 1st, the new shelter belt was in. The Spirit Lake Beacon ran a 4-photograph spread the following Sunday under the headline, "New shelter belt goes in where the old one was cut down." The lead photograph showed Lynn Brimwald, age 10, kneeling beside a 30-in Norway spruce sapling with her gloves still on. The caption read, "Lynn Brimwald planted her first tree at the Osland Ranch on June 27, 2026. The Norway spruce she planted is expected to reach mature height by 2076. The 4,800-head hog confinement operation continued at full capacity. The Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji real estate market began stabilizing in July. By August, the average days on market for Lakeshore Vista properties had returned to 39 days. By September, the average list price had recovered to within 4% of pre-October 2025 valuations. The new shelter belt, 58 years younger than the one it had replaced, was not yet tall enough to provide visual or olfactory buffer, but it was growing. It would by 2085 be a 60-year-old shelter belt. It would by then belong to my grandniece Lynn Brimwald and my grandnephew Sigvard Brimwald. It would by then have outlived me by approximately 25 years. The Lakeshore Vista at East Okoboji HOA under Tor Renwald's continued chairmanship has maintained constructive relations with our family ranch since June of 2026. The new shelter belt has grown approximately 14 in per year on the cottonwoods, 8 in per year on the oaks, and 7 in per year on the Norway spruce. By the spring of 2030, the cottonwood row had reached approximately 28 ft. The visual buffer between our ranch and Lakeshore Vista was partial but established. By the spring of 2035, the cottonwood row had reached approximately 42 ft. The visual buffer was nearly complete. By the spring of 2040, the cottonwood row had reached approximately 58 ft. The visual buffer was complete. The hog confinement operation continued at full capacity through every year between 2026 and the present. The operation employed a steady 21 full-time Iowa State University Extension-trained swine production technicians. It contributed approximately $940,000 annually to the Dickinson County agricultural tax base. It supplied a Hormel-affiliated processing plant in Alona with approximately 15,000 finished hogs annually. I established the Olaf Osland Memorial Iowa Heritage Shelter Belt Restoration Fund in November of 2026. The fund provides matching grants and Iowa State University Extension agronomic guidance to Iowa farmers replanting heritage shelter belts on private agricultural land. Helena serves as the fund's master coordinator. Larson Toberman at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Forestry Bureau serves as the fund's policy advisor. Aldrich Eklund serves as the fund's pro bono general counsel. The fund has, in the 4 years since its founding, supported the replanting of approximately 118,000 Iowa shelter belt trees across 47 Iowa farms. The fund's first matching grant funded the replanting on Wendell Brimstead's family ranch outside Trillium Bay. Wendell Brimstead's father's 1,958 windbreak, replanted in 2026 with Iowa-grown white oak saplings, is now 28 feet tall on the Cottonwood Row, 14 ft on the Oak Row, and 12 ft on the Spruce Row. Wendell Brimstead waters it every Sunday morning. He has not missed a Sunday since February of 2026. Hilda turned 75 in 2035. She still runs the Hereford cow-calf operation alongside Helena. She still bakes the rhubarb strawberry pie on Sunday mornings. She has not slowed down. Helena was promoted to Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Forestry Bureau Deputy Director in 2013. She drives to Des Moines every Wednesday morning and home every Wednesday evening. B expanded his Spirit Lake veterinary practice to include a small animal clinic in 2029. B also serves on the Iowa Pork Producers Association Sustainability Committee. Lynn graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agronomy in 2038. She is now a third-generation Iowa State Extension agent. She lives in the original 1922 Osland homestead with her husband and their 2 children. Sigvard graduated from Iowa State University Veterinary School in 2041. He joined Bjarna's practice in 2042. I'm Stan Osland. I'm 83 years old today. I sit on the front porch most mornings with a thermos of black coffee and a copy of the Iowa Code Chapter 657A annotated volume my Drake Law School advisor gave me in 2004. The Cottonwood Row is 62 ft tall. The shelter belt is 15 years old. My father planted the first one when I was 7. I planted the second one when I was 68. Hild and Helena and Lynn and Sigvard will plant the third one when the second one stops growing. That is how an Iowa shelter belt works. That is how an Iowa family works. Last evening, the 7 of us, me, Hilda, Helena, Biana, Lynn, her husband, and Sigvard, drove the family pickup down to a steakhouse in Spirit Lake called the Cedar Inn. We ate prime rib and creamed corn at a corner booth. The jukebox played the Carter Family. We drove home with the windows down. The Iowa October evening was cool. A red-tailed hawk crossed Cottonwood Lane in front of our headlights and disappeared into the Cottonwood Row my father's father planted in 1965. Hilda leaned forward from the back seat and tapped my shoulder. She said the cottonwoods sounded like rain when the wind came down off the lake at night. She said Daddy used to say the same thing. She said our father would have been proud of the second planting, Lynn, 28 now, with her own daughter asleep in a car seat between her and her husband. Said the spruce row she had set in the ground at age 10 was already taller than she was. Sigvard, 25, said the same thing about his bur oaks. The pickup turned onto the gravel road that runs the last half-mile up to the headquarters. The Cottonwood Row stood black against the late glow on our left. The hog confinement operation hummed quietly on our right. Iowa Code Chapter 657A held the line between them the way it has held the line for 47 Iowa years, the way it will hold. The line for the 47 that come after trust didn't fall because, thank God, because then have been waiting since 2014 for the specific moment when I co-chapter 6578 would project a 4,800 head hog confinement operation on land and naturally had just cleared with his own contractor for 58 months across the Iowa Creek Lakes region. The Trust family had been running a heritage shutterbell destruction scheme for an entry-affiliated view enhancement. Requests cutting down a 60-year-old wind bras cross 6 Iowa counties, stealing approximately $8 million in secondary market timber and pocketing approximately $420,000 in fraudulent clearance fees. The scheme survived for 5 years on the assumption that no one landowner adjacent to the HOA clear shutter would understand the right to farm consequence of the clearance. That's the lesson. A skill shores on the assumption that the windbreak was protecting the A from the farmer. Brim strength is understanding that windbreak was protecting the A from the law. Stan beat them with the anger. He beat them with the Iowa Code. Chapter 6578. He let his knees document. He let the coordinate. He let the federal meal fat predicate complete itself. He let his grandfather 60-year-old shutter bell do the rest. If you ever had a naturally cut down the bud for your family planted, drop your story in the comments. We here can subscribe next week. We had to custom when tried to produce a man's Harmony lobster pout. Turns out the lobster man's grandfather wrote the State Harbor Master Regulation.